You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hi, my name is Robin Erickson, and I'm a principal researcher in the Human Capital Center at the Conference Board. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Insights. I'd like to get us started by asking you a provocative question. What if your organization could deliver twice as much innovation, boost customer satisfaction ratings, grow the human capital return on investment by 270%, improve efficiency up to 15%, and increase profitability by 25%? I bet everyone would like to do at least some of those. So we'd like to tell you how that's possible. Today, my colleagues and co-authors, Solange Charas and Stela Lupushor, are joining me to discuss the results from a recently published report about understanding workforce experience through the lens of human capital analytics and how the pandemic has changed the way organizations think about workplace experience. So, Solange, if you wouldn't mind, would you start us off by telling the audience about how organizations can actually achieve these amazing results?
Sure, Robin, and thank you for having me today. Organizations that are sensitive to and invest in the experience of their workers are already seeing some of these results, as both external research and our own research findings are confirming. A positive experience boosts employee affiliation, engagement, and loyalty to the organization, which ultimately results in positive impact on productivity and innovation. Initiatives designed by guessing what the workforce will respond to and not generating positive outcomes. They have to be informed and supported by the rigor of human capital analytics and continual feedback loops.
Thank you for that, Solange. And I'm sure we've captured our audience's attention. Please also tell everyone about the study methodology and the 4 research questions that we were looking at.
Happy to. This report's findings are based on interviews and 2 independent studies. The first survey was conducted in February of 2020, just before COVID-19 took hold across the United States. We call that the pre-pandemic survey. The second was conducted in October of 2020. We're considering that to be mid-pandemic. And that survey focused on how the pandemic was changing the way organizations think about workplace experience. The 4 research questions, not to be confused with the 4 Passover questions, include: how have the events of 2020 changed how organizations think about the workforce? How can we better understand the workforce experience through the use of analytics? How can we better understand the relationship between the workforce experience and human capital, or HC programs, supporting the end-to-end employment lifecycle? And lastly, how can we better understand the relationship between human capital programs and enterprise-level performance?
Thank you so much, Solange. And I liked your joke. Have to make sure we're not...
It is springtime.
It is springtime, exactly.
We're right in the middle of Passover and
Easter's
and
spring
just
and
coming up.
Yes,
so we're in the mood.
Thank you for that background information. And Stela, I'd love to have you walk us through what we found in regard to understanding the workforce experience through the use of human capital analytics, and also how we expanded the Conference Board definition of employee experience to define workforce experience.
For sure, Robin, and thank you so much for having me today as well. The report views workforce experience through the lens of human capital analytics. Human capital analytics captures data through both quantitative and qualitative analysis, and data obtained about the employment journey can be correlated to other measurements of the human capital function, as well as enterprise-level performance. This type of analysis can provide insights about employees as well as program efficiencies. So for the purposes of this report, the Conference Board has expanded its definition of employee experience to include all the workers, not just the regular employees, but the full-time, part-time, gig worker, contractors, and defines the workforce experience as follows: how a worker thinks, feels, during the entire organizational journey, from the beginning as a prospect to becoming a candidate to being hired, through the onboarding process, internal movement, promotion, and then finally at the retirement or exit, including all the interactions along the way. Our study participants demonstrated that they are starting to embrace this broader definition of the workforce, including staff augmentation, managed service providers, third-party sources, alumni, and even digital labor. While there is no significant difference in the pre to mid-pandemic survey results, it is also very encouraging to see that most participants in the mid-pandemic survey, which is about 86% of them, rely on external labor market information in their workforce planning. This trend was also reflected in the previous report, where changes in the measurements and program focus highlighted the disproportionate impact of the 2020 events on underserved communities. The majority of survey participants have specific programs to support the workforce experience. That's about 82%. Also, it is interesting to note that the events of 2020 have made no significant difference in how many leaders are held accountable for the workforce experience, which is they don't. This raises the question of why 52% of organizations do not hold their leaders accountable for the experiences of their organization's workforce. The majority of survey participants have specific programs to support the workforce experience, 82%. It is also interesting to note that the events of 2020 had made no significant difference in how many leaders are held accountable for the workforce experience, only 48%. This raises the question on why 52% of organizations do not hold their leaders accountable for the experience of their organization's workforce. Without a robust system of accountability for the workforce experience, leaders will have fewer incentives to role model, to correct the behavior, to have limited impact on the outcome ultimately. Organizations must hold leaders accountable for the workforce experience if they want to move the needle on worker affiliation, engagement, and productivity. Solange, would you like to share the rest of the findings on this topic?
Absolutely. We also found in our mid-pandemic survey that onboarding remained the top focus of the experience journeys, especially since organizations had to reimagine how to integrate their new hires into something different from the pre-pandemic work environment. Rewards and recognitions moved to second place as organizations had to recognize and compensate performance and actively engage and recognize the extra mile that employees went to ensure productivity and engagement. Also, many respondents had to revisit their compensation approaches by considering pay cuts, the impact of furloughs, and the implications of having employees work from different U.S. tax jurisdictions. One interesting observation from our survey is that organizations are focusing transformational initiatives primarily on the new hire part of the worker journey, with 76% of respondents indicating that they have these initiatives related to candidate experience, and 91% focused on onboarding. Less attention is given to what happens before and after becoming a new hire, a trend that may have to change once the pandemic is over to ensure people stay productive, engaged, and skilled. Comparing our pre- and mid-pandemic survey results, we have seen changes in how people work and how they interact with the organization. As many knowledge workers migrated to remote work, human capital and other leaders realized that distributed work can be as productive as co-located work. However, instead of assuming that traditional ways of working can be easily shifted to virtual work, organizations need to reframe and reimagine how workflows and interactions can be designed to minimize the friction and maximize the expected outcomes for both parties, the worker and the organization. In furthering this goal, it is critical to understand the digital and integrated experience from the perspective of what workers need and want in the aggregate, not individually, and how to design an experience that minimizes or eliminates barriers to productivity, engagement, and innovation. The scope of such a transformation, needless to say, is complex and requires an integrated effort between IT, communications, human capital policies, day-to-day management, even space planning, all coordinated into an overarching work strategy. Per our survey respondents, the importance of this cross-functional collaboration increased in the pre- and mid-pandemic workplace, increased from the pre-pandemic to the mid-pandemic workplace. Most notably, our survey demonstrated the shift in cross-function collaboration and the focus to affect improvements in workforce experience from 58% pre-pandemic to 70% mid-pandemic.
Thank you so much, Solange. You packed a lot in there in terms of reporting out our results. I actually just wanted to make a comment that I was shocked by a figure that I heard last week. One of our council members said that over 30% of their employees had never set foot in their office space. And I said, how could that be? And he said, well, with regular turnover and growth, 30% of our employees have never actually been to the workplace. And so there's definitely a lot that organizations are going to need to be thinking about as they start to get ready for their returning to the workplace. And so anyway, I just thought that that was an interesting figure to put in there, to put all of this stuff into context.
It also reflects the findings that the Conference Board CEO annual survey showed, which is the two amongst the top priorities that CEOs are thinking about is workforce and real estate. So that mirrors perfectly what we're seeing both at the CEO level and now what we're seeing at the HR level.
Terrific. Thank you, Solange. But Stela, I really would love to hear about the interview that you did with Microsoft, because it's a great example of a cross-functional collaboration to improve workforce experience, especially because it has that cute little acronym that you can explain to everyone.
Absolutely. So over the past 3 years, Microsoft Human Capital function was at the forefront of major organizational transformation, and they were deeply involved in the creation of products for both internal and external customers. So this transformation was shaped by a very inspiring vision document that articulated how important it is the employee experience. And that statement started with the following. At Microsoft, our workers define the identity of our company. We come to work every day to carry out our mission, to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. And we require work environment and experiences that live up to the boldness of that mission. How inspiring is that? The company invested in creating a frictionless and secure physical and digital experiences throughout all the Microsoft facilities. So at the beginning, a lot of this work was focused on the physical and digital environment. The investments had included custom-built and integrated platform that was called MyHub. And this platform was providing a single access point for managers, for leaders, for workers, and even the former employees and partners to a variety of services and functions beyond just the HR and human capital processes. It also provided the multiple channels and access to support that was enabled through applications, virtual agents, social media, old good phone and emails, or even in-person walk-ins. A variety of data, quantitative and qualitative, was used, including data from the Leach telemetry that was integrated in a lot of the Microsoft products to understand what the users need, along with using the measurements of success. And these measurements of success were reflected through the so-called HEART framework, which is happiness, engagement, adoption, retention, and task success. So the one part that was exciting to me was the fact that workers were involved in deciding what are the next features, changes, improvements to be worked on. So in essence, it wasn't only the product owners and designers that were involved in those decisions, but it was a joint co-creative process with the workers. Designing, experimentation, and implementing the solution was done in a very agile fashion, and it was used to adapt the changes in how the work is done during the pandemic as well. I would encourage those of you who are interested to explore more this case study to check the full version of it on the TCB website.
Thank you so much, Stela. I love the fact that Microsoft was able to come up with an acronym that actually gets to, no pun intended, but the heart of the employee experience, right? I mean, I love that both the acronym works and it sort of gets at the employee experience, which is looking at and trying to capture and keep the hearts of employees. So I would actually like to speak briefly now about our findings on the relationship between the workforce experience and the human capital programs that we were surveying. So as you guys know, human capital's traditional approach, which informs most of its decision-making, is to focus on improving processes, adopting new technologies, usually without pilots, not always successfully, and establishing program measurements with performance expectations specific to each sub-function within the human capital area. And most of the time, most of these functions are siloed. So this traditional approach excludes the value of the perspective of a customer. And in fact, this report, we initially called it the internal customer rather than the workforce. But that traditional approach excludes the approach of the employee, which is starting from a potential new employee's first experience as a prospect, and then become an applicant when they fill out many, many confusing forms, all the way to being hired and then growing within the organization. And then the experience of actually exiting or retiring from the organization and all the steps along the way. So in keeping with the theme of employee-centric approaches, we believe that the next horizon for human capital is to transition from that myopic, siloed, process-focused perspective to that of the worker journey, starting from the point where workers know nothing about the brand, moving to where they discover the brand, decide to bring their talent to it. They are inspired to apply, to join, to actually do the work, to be engaged, to get trained, advance their careers, and so on. And as part of our survey, we identified the steps along the worker journey to understand if and how the organizations that we surveyed actually manage each step. So the top journeys that respondents indicate that they do not measure basically at all are returning, life events, and prospect engagement. So those are definitely some areas that companies should be thinking about, what are your programs and what are you measuring? And then this finding reinforces the point that organizations primarily focus their measurements on while you are here for work, which is, just what can you give us today? Instead of anything related to that, to engaging their workers before they decide to join, after they leave, or with relationships with their networks. Because that's actually something that a lot of organizations could tap into, is tapping into their alumni networks. So we've come to the last part of this podcast, and that's about understanding the relationship between human capital programs and enterprise performance. And Solange, this is where you went really deep with your analysis. And so I'd love to have you share that with our listeners.
And I'm very anxious to share this with our listeners because this is my passion area. The focus of this report was about the use of talent analytics or use of human capital analytics to basically understand how well an organization is managing its employees, developing and designing and administering programs, and generating impact for the organization. So we've heard about the first two aspects. Now we're going to hear about the third. And because this was a survey that was focused on whether or not companies are using analytics, we adopted a high analytics approach to understand the survey findings. So we actually applied the rigor and the approaches that we are trying to encourage in our clients on ourselves and this report. So to best understand how the human capital programs and people results or outcomes in the aggregate impact the organization, we started by calculating certain metrics, and we tracked this over time. These macro level indicators that we looked at include HCROI, or human capital return on investment, HCVA, human capital value add, revenue factor, or sometimes called productivity. And if the company was public, which we segmented out public companies from our private company participants so that we could gather reliable and valid financial information, we were able to calculate HEVA, human economic value add, and HCMV, which is human capital market value. In the aggregate, these macroeconomic indicators inform how effective human capital programs are, how the level of contribution that the aggregate human capital has on the organization. And most importantly, and this is so timely, it helps organizations understand the material impact of human capital on their organizations. the alphabet soup that I just spouted are all algorithms that you can easily calculate in your own organizations and track over time, as well as correlate to other performance indicators in your organization. So if you track net promoter score or you track market share, in addition to tracking financial performance, you can use these to understand the contribution that human capital has on those performance indicators. For our study, we wanted to understand if there was a statistically significant and substantive impact on human capital based on some of these metrics that we identified. We used, as I said, data analytic approaches. We used bivariate analysis. We used ANOVAs, which is analysis of variance, and we used multivariate analysis, including structural equation models, to try to explain and predict what we were seeing in our own data. Most participating organizations, public and private, we found, or they reported, were using human capital analytics intermittently. And that represented about 85% of our respondents. And that's excellent. We're loving that. Well, me as a data wonk, I'm definitely loving that. And as I said, we segregated our public companies from our private company survey participants and gathered additional data so that we could go one step further and try to correlate the survey responses to financial performance. So what we essentially looked at was we measured human capital return on investment and we measured productivity. Those are the two that we really focused on. So we found that 85% of the survey participants were intermittently using human capital analytics. But we also asked whether or not our participating organizations had dedicated human capital analytics functions. And what we found was a little bit more than half of our respondents actually have a dedicated human capital analytics function, close to 56%, which means that 44% do not have a dedicated human capital analytics function in their organization. And that human capital analytics function ranged from having between 2 and 10 dedicated HCA professionals. So when they had a function, it was a relatively small function. The profile of our public company survey participants was rather large. So about $100 billion in market capitalization. So these are organizations that could definitely afford to invest in human capital analytics. They're not outside of the earnings range to be able to make those investments. Here are some of the really interesting results that we found. Companies with dedicated human capital analytics functions had a human capital return on investment, that is, a return on every dollar invested in human capital programs and people, of $19.75. So for every dollar that they put into people programs and people, they got $19.75 back. Those organizations, and that sounds pretty good, right? That sounds actually very good. Those organizations that did not have a dedicated human capital analytics function were only getting about a $7.25 return on investment on those dollars that they dedicate to human capital. So that's a 270% higher level of return on investment just by having a dedicated human capital analytics function and using the data to inform your decisions. The other measure that we looked at was efficiency, and you can basically look at efficiency in terms of a profitability measure. And we saw that organizations with dedicated HCA functions have approximately 14% higher levels of efficiency in overall human capital performance. So their profit margins are that much higher. And that's a really nice bivariate correlation finding. If you invest in human capital analytics, you're going to have higher HCROI, which eventually turns into higher levels of profitability. We saw a couple of other things that we consider to be mythbusters. Many organizations operate under the assumption that controlling headcount drives profitability. Sort of makes sense. If you cut heads, you cut expense, you improve profitability, right? However, when we looked at this in a structural equation model, we actually saw something quite different. Well, first, we saw that there is a weak relationship between actual headcount. So it doesn't make any difference if you have 100 employees that you pay $1 million to, or one employee that you pay $1 million to. It's really what you spend. So that was the first thing that we're trying to communicate as a mythbuster, which is it's not based on headcount, it's based on what you spend. The other thing that we found is that organizations with higher levels of productivity, per employee productivity, were associated with organizations that actually spend more on their employees. They invest in their employees. So if you want to drive productivity, which eventually generates profitability, don't cut your investment in human capital. Invest in human capital, but do it the right way, informed by human capital analytics. So I think those are the big takeaway points that we saw using a deeper dive analytics approach.
Well, thank you so much, Solange. And I am quite sure that we do have some listeners here who really do geek out on all the numbers, and they saw analytics in the title, and so they joined us. So I hope you all enjoyed just hearing Solange's enthusiasm and our enthusiasm, actually, for finding some hard statistics that show the connection for something that most of us have known for a long time, but may not have had that actual quote unquote proof. And I also want to thank Solange and Stela for all of the hard work you put into this report. Solange is a Distinguished Principal Research Fellow and has worked on other reports with us, as well as Stela, who's a Senior Fellow and a Program Director for many of our councils, and worked on other reports with us. And I know that you do that because you're passionate about this topic, and just want to say thank you again for all of your hard work. And I'd also like to thank those of you who joined us today, and hope that you have a better idea of how organizations can accelerate value by using human capital analytics to understand the workforce experience. So if you'd like to find out more, please visit our website at tcb.org/podcasts or /webcasts for more interactive programs. We actually did do a webcast back in February of 2021, if you're interested in finding out more information on this. You can also find our podcasts on other platforms like iTunes or Spotify. Thanks again, and goodbye.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.